Arthur Thistlewood stands in the dim hayloft on the evening of 23 February 1820, running his thumb over the worn grip of a pistol while listening to the quiet, nervous breathing of the men gathering around him. He is waiting for a signal that will never come, unaware that the quiet street below has already been sealed by soldiers and magistrates who know exactly what they have planned. In the winter of 1820, a group of working-class men gathered in a cramped hayloft above a quiet London mews, armed with little more than worn pistols and a desperate belief that violence might finally force a listening ear. What followed was a sudden raid, a fatal struggle in the dark, and a series of trials that asked whether these men were dangerous revolutionaries or the victims of a carefully laid government trap. The story moves through the shadowed back streets of Marylebone, the formal halls of the Old Bailey, and the public square where justice was carried out with a severity that shocked even its own time. This is the story of the Cato Street conspiracy, told gently, with care for the historical record and respect for those whose lives were forever altered by the events of early 19th century London. Good evening, and welcome. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, please do. Close your eyes whenever you wish. Let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. His name was Arthur Thistlewood. He was a restless, self-educated man shaped by poverty and unwavering political conviction, and he carried a quiet exhaustion that no one outside his small circle ever truly saw. Beneath the historical label of conspirator, he was a husband and father who had waited too long for the world to listen. When I think of him in that final hour, I do not picture a revolutionary leader plodding in the shadows. I picture a tired man running his fingers over a leather-bound notebook, feeling the edges of political pamphlets pressed against delicate dried flowers from a wife who had already passed. I picture him checking the weight of a pistol, not because he loved the violence it promised, but because it felt heavy with the promise of a voice. He was 45 years old, which in that era meant his joints ached when the damp set in, and his sleep was often broken by the quiet, relentless worry of a man who knew how to count pennies and knew exactly when they ran out. He was born in a small village in Lincolnshire, the illegitimate son of a farmer who could not or would not give him a proper name. That single fact, the absence of a recognized place in a rigid society, followed him through every room he ever entered. It taught him early that the world was not built to accommodate him, and it gave him a fierce, quiet determination to build his own understanding of justice. He taught himself to read when most boys his age were already bound to apprenticeships or fields. He read everything he could find, moving from simple pamphlets to dense political philosophy, tracing the lines of thought that argued men were not born to serve the earth, but to share it. He served briefly in the army, which gave him a straight posture and a disciplined way of moving through the world, but it also showed him the machinery of the state from the inside. He saw how orders were given, how they were obeyed, and how little the men who carried the muskets mattered to the men who drew the maps. He traveled to France, where the echoes of the Great Revolution still lingered in the cobblestones and the faces of the people. He crossed the sea to America, absorbing the strange, new ideas about liberty that floated in the taverns and market squares. He returned to England with a mind full of fire and a body that knew how to endure cold. He did not return with wealth. He returned with a certainty that the systems governing his life were fundamentally broken, and he carried that certainty like a stone in his coat pocket, heavy and smooth from years of handling. He tried to work within the world as it was, but the world kept closing its doors. He joined radical meetings in cramped rooms above pubs, where working men gathered to argue about representation and the price of bread. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who knew that careless speech could cost him his freedom. He became known as a man who listened more than he spoke, and who only raised his voice when the argument required it. In 1816, he stood among a crowd at Spa Fields, watching men march with makeshift weapons in desperate hopes, believing for a brief moment that the government might finally have to look at them. The march ended in chaos, and the government responded with arrests and trials. He was charged with high treason, a word that carried the weight of the gallows and the axe. He sat in a cold cell, listening to the footsteps of guards on the stone floor, wondering if this was how his story would end. He was acquitted, but the trial left him hollowed out. The law had looked at him and found him guilty enough to try, and innocent enough to release, which taught him that innocence was not a shield, but a temporary reprieve. He married a woman named Susan, and they had a son. They lived in a small room where the damp crept up the walls in winter, and where the sound of the street outside was a constant reminder of the bustling city that kept moving while they struggled to keep pace. He loved them in the quiet ways that men of his station knew how to love. He brought home a small piece of cheese when he could spare the coins. He sat by the fire in the evenings, reading aloud from borrowed books, his voice low and steady, while his wife mended clothes by the fading light. He held his son on his knee and traced the shape of the boy's small hand, thinking about what kind of world would welcome him when he grew up. He knew it would not be the same world he had inherited. He hoped it would be kinder. He did not know how to make it so. He only knew that the old ways of petitioning and waiting had failed, and that the men in power had grown deaf to the sound of their names being called. His first wife had died before he met Susan, and he kept her memory in that worn leather notebook. He pressed flowers from the garden they had shared, tiny fragile things that held their color through the years. He wrote down passages from pamphlets on the same pages, mixing the scent of dried petals with the sharp, clear language of political theory. I like to imagine him sitting at a narrow wooden table, the notebook open before him, his pen moving slowly across the paper. He was not a man who believed in violence for its own sake. He believed in it as a last resort, a terrible language spoken only when every other word had been exhausted. He carried a quiet grief for the world he wanted to see, and a growing anger at the world that refused to change. He was not a monster. He was a man who had run out of patience, and who had convinced himself that a single, decisive strike could tear down a wall that had stood for centuries. In 1817, his frustration boiled over into a gesture that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wrote a letter to Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, challenging him to a duel. It was a reckless act, born of sleepless nights and the bitter taste of injustice. He knew the law would not treat a duel challenge as a gentleman's affair when it came from a working-class radical. He knew it would be seen as a threat. He was imprisoned again for sending it, and the cell he entered that time felt colder, the walls closer. He spent months alone with his thoughts, listening to the rain on the roof, wondering if his wife and child were eating, wondering if the boy would remember his face. He emerged from that prison thinner, quieter, but no less certain. The government had shown him exactly what it thought of him, and he had decided to return the favor in kind. He began to gather men who shared his exhaustion, men who had also been pushed to the edge of what they could endure. He did not recruit them with grand speeches. He spoke to them in low voices, sharing a pot of weak tea, listening to their stories of lost work and sick children, and slowly, carefully, letting the idea of action take root in their minds. The mystery of that winter in 1820 is not why men like Arthur Thistlewood gathered in a dark loft with weapons. The mystery is how a devoted father, a man who kept dried flowers pressed in a notebook, convinced himself that violence was the only language left of the unheard. It is the question of how quiet desperation hardens into resolve, and how the weight of waiting becomes heavier than the fear of acting. I think about him standing in that loft on the evening of 23 February, feeling the cold air seep through the gaps in the wooden walls, listening to the breathing of the men around him. He was not thinking of glory, he was thinking of a ladder. He was thinking of a single candle. He was thinking of whether this would be the night the powerful finally heard them. And I wonder what he would have done if he had known the street below was already holding its breath, waiting for him to step into a trap that had been set long before he ever climbed those wooden stairs. The world that shaped him was not a distant backdrop. It was the damp floor beneath his boots, the high price of the loaf he bought on his way home, the silence of the magistrates when petitions were presented, the sharp crack of a musket at Peterloo the summer before. Every detail of place and period exists only to explain why he stood in that hayloft. He was a man who had been told to wait, to be patient, to trust in the slow turning of justice, and he had waited until the waiting itself became a kind of violence. He believed that a carefully laid trap was actually an open door. He believed that the men gathering around him were stepping into history, when in truth, history had already been written by the men who owned the street below. But I am getting ahead of myself. The story of that night does not begin with a pistol or a ladder. It begins with a city that had forgotten how to feed its people, and with men who had forgotten how to hope without fear. Chapter 2. The winter of 1820 was a long, slow suffocation for the working men of London. It was not just the cold, though the cold was real enough, biting through thin coats and settling into the bones. It was the quiet, grinding pressure of a world that had contracted, leaving thousands of skilled artisans and tradesmen with nothing to sell and no one to hire them. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, and the peace that followed brought not prosperity, but a sudden, brutal adjustment. Factories closed, orders dried up. The men who had woven cloth, forged iron, shaped wood, and cut meat found themselves standing in doorways, watching their livelihoods dissolve into memory. Bread prices climbed steadily, pushed higher by laws designed to protect the landowners who grew the grain. The corn laws meant that working families spent more than half their wages on food, leaving little for rent, for medicine, for the small comforts that make a room feel like a home. There was no safety net. There was only the parish poorhouse, which carried a stigma so heavy that most men would rather starve quietly than walk through its doors. Hunger was not an abstract concept. It was a physical presence, sitting at the table, watching the children sleep, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. In this landscape of scarcity, radical ideas did not flourish as intellectual luxuries. They took root as survival mechanisms. Men gathered in back rooms and taverns, sharing pamphlets printed on cheap paper, passing them from hand to hand until the ink faded and the edges grew soft. They spoke of Thomas Spence, a radical thinker who had argued decades earlier that the land belonged to the people who worked it, not to the aristocrats who held the deeds. His followers called themselves Spencean philanthropists, and they met in small groups, discussing how to build a society where wealth was shared and power was distributed. They were not a large movement. They were a scattered network of exhausted men who had realized that the official channels for change were closed to them. The government had passed a series of laws known as the Six Acts, which made it illegal to hold public meetings, restricted the press, and made it easier to punish anyone who spoke out against the Crown or the Parliament. The Six Acts were not just legislation, they were a message. They told working men to keep their heads down, to go back to their workbenches, to stop asking for a voice they were not legally entitled to hold. Arthur Thistlewood moved through this world with a quiet intensity. He knew the names of the men who sat in Parliament. He knew the names of the ministers who had signed the orders that dispersed the crowds at Peterloo the previous summer. He knew that the government saw him as a nuisance, a dangerous spark that needed to be stamped out before it caught fire. But he also knew that the government was afraid. The fear was visible in the soldiers patrolling the streets, in the spies lingering in taverns, in the sudden raids on printing presses. The fear was the only thing that gave the working men a sense of leverage, however fragile. And it was in this atmosphere of mutual suspicion and quiet desperation that a man named George Edwards entered the story. George Edwards was a maker of plaster casts. He worked with his hands, shaping delicate figurines of saints and animals, his fingers moving with a careful, practiced grace. He was a quiet man, unassuming, the kind of person you would pass on the street without a second glance. He moved in the same radical circles as Thistlewood, attending meetings, nodding in agreement, offering opinions that sounded sincere. He never carried himself like a leader. He never demanded attention. He simply listened and remembered and reported back to the men who paid him. He was an agent of the Home Office, a government informer whose job was to weave himself into the fabric of working-class radicalism and pull at the threads until the whole thing unraveled. He did not wear a uniform. He wore a worn coat and a tired expression, and he spoke the language of the people he was betraying with a fluency that made him almost invisible. He knew exactly what to say to men who were starving, who felt abandoned, who were looking for a sign that someone finally cared. He gave them that sign, carefully, slowly, letting them believe he was one of them. Among the men Edwards gathered were William Davidson and James Ings. They were not strangers to hardship. They were men who had been shaped by the same economic currents that had hollowed out Thistlewood's life. William Davidson was a shoemaker, born in Kingston, Jamaica, to a father who held high office, and a mother who had known the cruelty of slavery. He had been sent to England for his education, trained in cabinet making, and eventually settled into the trade of leather and thread. He was a large, physically powerful man, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that came from knowing exactly who he was in a world that tried to tell him otherwise. He was also a devout Methodist, a man who prayed quietly before meetings, holding his faith and his radicalism in a careful, private balance. He did not see a contradiction between believing in God and believing in justice. He saw them as two sides of the same coin, both demanding that the powerful care for the weak. He had a wife and children in London, and he worked long hours at his bench, his hands moving quickly, his mind turning over the same questions that kept Thistlewood awake at night. He knew what it meant to be excluded from the social hierarchies of both his birthplace and his adopted country. He knew that the only thing standing between him and oblivion was his own stubborn refusal to disappear. James Ings was a butcher, a trade that required strength, precision, and a certain detachment. He had run a small shop once, but the post-war economic contraction had hollowed out his business, leaving him with unpaid debts and a family to feed. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, with a volatile temper that he usually kept tightly leashed. He sang softly to his children at night, a habit he maintained even when the cupboards were bare and the rent was overdue. He sang lullabies and folk songs, his voice low and steady, trying to fill the room with something other than fear. He believed in the cause Thistlewood was building, not because he loved abstract political theory, but because he saw the direct line between the men in Parliament and the empty plates on his table. He believed that if the people who controlled the price of grain could be forced to listen, even for a moment, the world might tip back toward fairness. He was a man who had been pushed to the edge of his own endurance, and who had decided that pushing back was the only option left. The men gathered in small groups, sharing information, testing each other's resolve, trying to piece together a plan that felt both dangerous and necessary. They were not a military force. They were a handful of working men with worn pistols, homemade swords, and a desperate hope that their actions would echo beyond the walls of their meeting rooms. They spoke of taking back what had been stolen from them, of forcing the government to acknowledge their existence. They did not speak of glory. They spoke of survival. And it was in this fragile, simmering atmosphere that a newspaper notice arrived. It appeared in a paper called The New Times, a brief report that the cabinet ministers would be dining together at the home of Lord Harrowby in Grosvenor Square on the evening of 23 February. It was a small piece of information, easily overlooked, but to the men in the loft it felt like a thread of light in a dark room. It meant the ministers would be gathered in one place, separated from their guards, vulnerable. It meant that a single, decisive strike could change everything. The notice was either a genuine coincidence, a routine social event reported by a careless journalist, or it was planted by the government to draw the conspirators into the open. Historians still argue over which is true. What matters is not the origin of the notice, but the effect it had on the men who read it. It transformed a vague, simmering frustration into a concrete, actionable plan. It gave them a date, a time, a location. It gave them something to focus their exhaustion on. Thistlewood read it, his eyes tracing the printed words, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He knew the risks. He knew the government was watching. He knew that stepping into the open meant leaving no room for retreat. But he also knew that waiting any longer would only deepen the despair. He began to make preparations, quietly, carefully, gathering weapons, checking the layout of the streets, planning the route from Cato Street to Grosvenor Square. He did not tell his wife what he was doing. He kissed his son goodnight, feeling the small, warm weight of the boy in his arms, and told himself that this was for him. He told himself that a better world was worth the risk. The quiet preparations in the weeks leading up to 23 February were filled with a strange, heavy intimacy. Men who had lived most of their lives in the margins were suddenly at the center of something vast. They met in the hayloft above the stable on Cato Street, a cramped, low-ceilinged space that smelled of hay and horse dung. They brought their own weapons, some bought with borrowed money, some kept from years past. They checked the firing mechanisms on the pistols, sharpened the edges of the blades, wrapped their hands in cloth to keep them steady. They spoke in low voices, their breath fogging in the cold air, listening to the horses shift and snort in the stalls below. They were not soldiers. They were shoemakers, butchers, carpenters, and laborers, trying to become something they had never been trained to be. They knew they were outmatched. They knew the government had soldiers, cannons, and the full weight of the law on its side. But they also knew that they had the truth of their suffering on theirs, and that sometimes truth is the only weapon the powerless have left. The central event, the raid that would shatter their lives, was always a felt presence in those quiet moments. Every conversation, every careful check of a pistol, every glance toward the ladder was shadowed by the knowledge of what was coming. The dinner notice was a fragile thread of hope, pulling them toward an irreversible step. They were walking into a room they believed was empty of eyes, unaware that the walls themselves were listening. They were preparing to strike at the heart of a government that had already decided their fate. And as the days passed and the date drew closer, the loft grew quieter, the men more focused, the weight of what they were about to do settling over them like a heavy coat. They were not thinking of history. They were thinking of survival. They were thinking of the men who had ignored them for too long. They were thinking of the ladder, the candle, the dark street below. They were thinking about whether this would finally be the moment the powerful heard them. Chapter 3. The evening of 23 February 1820 arrived slowly, bringing with it a cold, damp darkness that clung to the streets of Marylebone. The sun had set by 5:30, and the back streets were already swallowed by shadow. Cato Street itself was a quiet, unremarkable thoroughfare, running off the Edgware Road, unpaved and poorly lit, with no gas lamps to push back the night. It was the kind of place people passed through without stopping, a service road for carriages and deliveries, not a destination. That quiet obscurity was exactly why the conspirators had chosen it. They arrived in ones and twos, slipping through the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the rough cobblestones. They did not speak as they climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft. They simply nodded to each other, their faces pale in the fading light, their hands tucked into their coats for warmth. The loft was cramped, the ceiling low, the air thick with the smell of dried grass and the damp wool of their coats. A single candle burned on a wooden crate, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The men gathered around it, their breath visible in the cold, their hands resting on the weapons they had brought. They waited for the others to arrive, listening to the quiet sounds of the stable below, the shifting of hooves, the soft snort of a horse. The plan was simple in theory, almost impossible in practice. They would proceed to Grosvenor Square, a mile to the southeast, to the large, well-appointed townhouse of Lord Harrowby. They would gain entry, perhaps by claiming to deliver a message, or by force if necessary. They would confront the cabinet ministers, who they believed were dining together behind closed doors. They intended to take the heads of Lords Sidmouth and Castlereagh as proof of their deed, to be displayed as a signal for a wider uprising. The words sound brutal, even now. I do not say them lightly. They are recorded in trial testimony, spoken by men who had convinced themselves that extreme measures were the only way to break the silence of the powerful. In the loft, the men did not speak of heads. They spoke of stopping the hunger, of ending the laws that kept the poor in chains, of making the government look at them. The violence was a means to an end, terrible and necessary in their minds, a way to force a conversation that had been refused for decades. Arthur Thistlewood moved among them, checking the weapons, speaking in low, steady tones. He carried his worn leather notebook in his coat pocket, feeling the familiar weight of it against his chest. He was calm. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and now that it was here, he felt a strange, quiet clarity. He knew the risks. He knew that if they were caught, the law would show them no mercy. But he also knew that they had no other door left to open. He looked at the men around him, seeing Davidson's steady gaze, Ings's tense shoulders, the young faces of boys who had never known a day without worry. He felt the weight of their trust, and the heavier weight of his responsibility. He did not want them to die. He wanted them to live in a world that did not force them to choose between starvation and rebellion. He believed that tonight, against all odds, they could tip the scale. While they gathered in the hayloft, the government was already moving. Lord Sidmouth and his officials had been receiving intelligence for weeks, fed to them by George Edwards. The dinner at Grosvenor Square had been cancelled quietly. The ministers dispersed to their own homes. The streets around Harrowby's townhouse left empty. The government had decided to let the conspiracy proceed to the point of action, to catch the men in the act, with weapons in hand, making the charge of high treason undeniable. It was a calculated risk, a deliberate choice to allow desperate men to walk into a trap. The decision was made in warm rooms, over polished tables, by men who had never gone to bed hungry. They did not see the conspirators as fathers or sons or shoemakers. They saw them as a threat to order, a spark that needed to be extinguished before it spread. And so they sent the Bow Street officers, the principal law enforcement body of the time, accompanied by a detachment of soldiers from the Coldstream Guards. The officers moved quietly through the dark streets, their boots careful on the cobblestones, their hands resting on their weapons. They reached Cato Street without drawing attention, slipping into the stable building, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. The leading officer was Richard Smithers, a family man who carried a small silver pocket watch gifted by his wife. He was a practical man, doing a job he believed was necessary for the peace of the city. He did not know the names of the men in the loft. He only knew that they were armed, that they were planning violence, that his orders were to stop them. He climbed the wooden ladder first, his boots finding the familiar rungs, his hand reaching for the edge of the loft floor. He pulled himself up, his head breaking the plane of the opening, and stepped into the cramped space. What happened next is not entirely clear, and it may never be. The loft was dark, crowded, filled with men whose nerves were stretched to breaking point. There was shouting, a sudden, sharp sound of movement, and then a blade flashed in the flickering candlelight. Smithers fell, fatally stabbed, his life ending in a single, irreversible moment. The pocket watch in his coat pocket stopped at the exact moment of the struggle, a small, silent witness to the sudden collision of two worlds that had been moving toward each other for months. The loft erupted into chaos. The candle was knocked over, extinguished instantly, plunging the space into near total darkness. Men shouted, stumbling over each other in the panic, the air thick with the smell of fear and the sharp tang of gunpowder as a pistol discharged. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the wooden walls, scattering the conspirators like startled birds. Some of them fled toward the window, dropping to the ground below, running into the dark streets. Others were pinned down by the advancing officers and soldiers, who poured into the loft, their weapons raised, their voices sharp with commands. Thistlewood managed to slip away in the confusion, dropping from the window, hitting the cobblestones hard, and disappearing into the maze of back streets. He did not look back. He ran through the cold air, his heart pounding, his mind racing, knowing that the night had gone horribly, irrevocably wrong. The ladder had held. The candle had burned. The street had not been holding its breath for them. It had been waiting for them to make a mistake. Several men were arrested in the loft that night. Others were captured in the following days as the city was locked down, the police searching every tavern, every lodging house, every shadowed alley. Thistlewood himself was found the next morning, 24 February, in a small room in Whitechapel. He did not resist. He simply stood as the officers entered, his hands visible, his face calm. He had run out of doors. The loft was gone. The plan was shattered. The only thing left was the weight of what they had tried to do, and the certainty that the law would now have its say. The weapons they had gathered were seized, catalogued, presented as evidence of a dangerous, coordinated plot. The blood on the stable floor was washed away. leaving only the memory of a struggle that had ended before it truly began. The men who had believed they were stepping into history were instead stepping into cells, their hopes replaced by the cold, hard reality of the gallows. The trials took place in April and May 1820 in the formal halls of the Old Bailey. The courtroom was a place of polished wood and strict procedure, a world far removed from the damp hayloft on Cato Street. The men who stood in the dock were exhausted, their clothes worn, their faces pale from weeks of confinement. They were no longer conspirators. They were defendants, stripped of their agency, forced to watch as the state constructed a narrative of guilt around them. The defense tried to argue entrapment. They pointed to George Edwards, the plaster cast maker who had never been called to the stand, who had disappeared from London as soon as the arrests were made. They asked the jury to consider whether the plot was a genuine expression of working-class desperation or a carefully manufactured trap set by the government to justify further repression. The argument was logical. It was also ignored. The court was not interested in the moral ambiguity of state surveillance. It was interested in order. The jury returned guilty verdicts for 5 of the men: Arthur Thistlewood, James Ings, William Davidson, John Brunt, and Richard Tidd. They were sentenced to death, the punishment for high treason carrying the full, brutal weight of the law. The other conspirators received lesser sentences, mostly transportation to the penal colonies in Australia, a fate that meant exile, hard labor, and the slow erosion of hope. I sit with the image of those trials, the quiet voices of exhausted men speaking in a room that was never built to hear them. The legal arguments were presented with cold precision, the evidence laid out, the verdict delivered without hesitation. But beneath the formal language was a simple, human tragedy. Men who had believed they were fighting for a better future were being erased from the present. The court did not ask why they were there. It did not ask about the empty cupboards, the high bread prices, the laws that made it illegal to gather in peace. It only asked whether they had broken the law. And by the strict letter of the law, they had. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. It protected itself from those who had nothing left to lose. And in doing so, it proved exactly what the men in the dock had been trying to say. The trial was not a search for truth. It was a demonstration of power. And when the sentences were read, the heavy silence that fell over the courtroom was the sound of a door closing forever. Chapter 4. The executions took place on the 1st of May, 1820, outside the gates of Newgate Prison. The morning was cold, the sky a flat, unbroken gray, the air carrying the damp promise of rain. A large crowd gathered, drawn by the spectacle of state justice, but also by a quiet, simmering curiosity about the men who had dared to challenge the government. The press had covered the trials extensively, painting the conspirators as dangerous revolutionaries, but also printing the details of their poverty, their desperation, the quiet lives they had led before the Loft. Public opinion was divided. Those aligned with the establishment saw the executions as necessary, a firm warning to anyone who thought of questioning the order of things. Those sympathetic to reform saw them as a tragedy, the sacrifice of men who had been pushed too far, caught in a system that offered no room for mercy. The crowd that gathered that morning was a mix of both, standing quietly, their breath visible in the chill air, waiting for the moment when the law would finish what it had started. The 5 condemned men were led to the scaffold one by one. They were hanged, the rope catching, the bodies falling still. But the law of treason in 1820 required more than a simple execution. After death, their heads were severed by a masked man using a surgical knife, a brutal, archaic punishment meant to mark them as enemies of the state. The act was met with immediate, visceral reaction from the crowd. A collective cry of shame rose from the gathered people, a sound of disgust and sorrow that echoed off the prison walls. It was a rare moment of public empathy, a recognition that the punishment had crossed the line from justice into cruelty. James Ings, the butcher who had sung to his children at night, reportedly hummed a radical song as he walked to the scaffold, his voice steady even at the end. William Davidson, the shoemaker who had held his faith in his politics and careful balance, stood quietly, his dignity unbroken. Arthur Thistlewood, the man who had carried his wife's dried flowers in a notebook, spoke calmly to the crowd, his words recorded by the press as a final declaration of his beliefs. He said he died in the cause of liberty. He said he had acted out of a duty to his country. He did not ask for forgiveness, he asked for remembrance. The executions did not trigger the wider uprising the conspirators had hoped for. The radical movement in London was deeply disrupted, its leaders imprisoned or exiled, its networks shattered by fear and surveillance. The government used the event to justify continued repression, pointing to the Loft as proof of the dangerous nature of working-class politics. But the memory of the executions lingered, a quiet stain on the conscience of the time. The cries of shame from the crowd were reported in the newspapers, repeated in taverns and meeting rooms, becoming part of the slow, underground history of British reform. The conspiracy was officially presented as a genuine plot, successfully foiled by the vigilance of the state. The question of entrapment, whether the plot would have taken the same shape without George Edwards, was left to the historians and the quiet conversations of men who knew how easily desperation could be shaped into a weapon. George Edwards himself vanished from public view. He was quietly removed from London by the Home Office, his name scrubbed from official records, his fate left to the shadows. Some accounts suggest he was given a new identity, sent abroad, allowed to live out his days in quiet anonymity. Others wonder if the guilt of what he had orchestrated eventually caught up with him, if the delicate figurines of saints he once made ever felt heavy in his hands. We do not know. The documentary record is incomplete, the communications between Edwards and the Home Office sealed away, leaving a gap in the history that speaks volumes about the government's willingness to protect its own instruments. The lack of prosecution for Edwards was not an oversight. It was a choice. It was the state saying, quietly but clearly, that some men are necessary, and that their actions will be forgiven if they serve the right side. The men who died on the scaffold knew nothing of his disappearance. They only knew that they had been led into a room they believed was empty, and that the walls had closed around them before they could speak. Historians have spent centuries weighing the theories, trying to untangle the threads of genuine conviction from the fabric of state manipulation. Some argue that the Cato Street conspiracy was exactly what the courts said it was, a dangerous plot by committed revolutionaries who intended to murder the cabinet and spark a wider insurrection. The evidence is there. The men gathered, they brought weapons, they had a plan. They had histories of radical activity, of attending meetings, of speaking out against the government. They were not passive victims. They made a choice, knowing the risks, believing in the necessity of their actions. To erase their agency is to treat them as children, incapable of making their own decisions, which is a disservice to the very cause they claim to serve. Others argue that the conspiracy was substantially the creation of George Edwards, a government agent who fed the men's desperation, guided their planning, and led them to a trap that had been waiting for months. The evidence for this is also there. Edwards provided the crucial intelligence about the cabinet dinner. He encouraged the shift from vague talk to specific action. He withdrew from the scene before the raid, leaving the men to walk alone into the dark. The government allowed the plot to proceed far longer than necessary, waiting for the perfect moment to make an example of them. If the state had wanted to stop the conspiracy, it could have done so weeks earlier. It chose not to. It chose to let the men gather their weapons, climb the ladder, and step into the light, knowing exactly what would happen next. That is not justice. That is theater, performed on a stage of blood. A third view, one that I find myself returning to in the quiet hours of the night, sees the conspiracy not as a simple plot or a simple trap, but as a symptom of a deeper, systemic failure. The men of Cato Street were not born into violence. They were pushed toward it by a political system that offered no legitimate channel for their grievances, by an economy that discarded them the moment the wars ended, by a legal framework that treated their hunger as a crime. The conspiracy was the predictable result of a society that had closed every door except the one that led to the gallows. It does not excuse the violence. It contextualizes it. It asks us to look past the swords and the pistols, past the trial transcripts and the government reports, and see the quiet exhaustion of men who had waited too long for the world to listen. The state manipulation is real. The men's conviction is also real. Both things can be true at the same time. A trap is only effective if there is something to catch inside it. The families of the executed men were left to navigate the aftermath in silence. The wives and children of Thistlewood, Davidson, Ings, Brunt, and Tidd were not given public tributes. They were not offered pensions or apologies. They were simply left to mourn in private, their grief unrecorded, their lives forever altered by the events of a single winter night. Susan Thistlewood had to raise their son alone, explaining to a growing boy why his father was not coming home. The children of James Ings had to learn to live without the quiet songs that had filled their room at night. William Davidson's mixed heritage, which had already placed him on the margins of society, now marked his family with the stigma of treason. The historical record does not tell us how they survived. It only tells us that they disappeared from the official narrative, swallowed by the same quiet obscurity that had defined their lives before the Loft. I think of them often. I think of the quiet strength it takes to continue living when the world has decided your love was a mistake. I think of the unmarked graves, the unspoken words, the years that passed without closure. The cost of conviction is rarely paid by the ones who hold the sword. It is paid by the ones who wait for the sword to fall. Chapter 5. The 5 executed men were buried within the precincts of Newgate Prison, as was the custom for those condemned for high treason. Their bodies were laid in the cold earth beneath the stone walls, their names spoken quietly by those who remembered, then slowly fading into the silence of the city. When Newgate was demolished in 1902, the remains of those buried within its grounds were moved, reinterred in unmarked graves, their final resting place lost to the slow turning of time. There is no dedicated public memorial to the Cato Street conspirators in London. You will not find their names carved into stone or their faces cast in bronze. You will not find a plaque on a wall or a garden dedicated to their memory. The state that executed them made sure of that. It did not want them remembered as martyrs. It wanted them remembered as criminals, a warning to future generations. But memory is a stubborn thing. It does not live in monuments. It lives in the quiet corners of history, in the pages of books, in the whispered stories passed from parent to child, in the slow, patient work of historians who refuse to let the truth be forgotten. William Davidson's participation has attracted renewed interest in recent decades, as part of a broader effort to recover the history of Black Britons in the early 19th century. For too long, the narrative of British radicalism was painted in a single color, ignoring the men who brought their own experiences of exclusion, of slavery, of displacement, to the fight for justice. Davidson was not a footnote. He was a man who stood in a cold loft, holding the weight of two worlds on his shoulders, and who believed that liberty was not a privilege, but a right. His story is slowly being told again, not as a curiosity, but as a testament to the quiet courage of men who refused to accept the limits placed upon them. The conspiracy itself remains a minor episode in the broader narrative of British history, overshadowed by larger events, less celebrated than later reform movements. But it is significant. It is a landmark in the history of state surveillance, an early, troubling example of a government using informers and agents provocateurs to shape the very crimes it claimed to be fighting. The Edwards case is still cited by historians of policing and civil liberties, a reminder that the line between protection and manipulation is often drawn in the dark. Cato Street itself still exists in the Marylebone area of London. It is a quiet residential muse now. The neighborhood changed beyond recognition from the working-class district it was 2 centuries ago. The stable building where the conspirators met no longer stands in its original form, replaced by newer structures, the hayloft and the horses long gone. But the narrow street remains exactly as it was, unassuming, still, holding its history in silence. If you walk down it on a quiet afternoon, you will find modest houses, their doors painted in soft colors, their windows reflecting the slow passage of the day. You will hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional voice of a passerby, the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. You will not find a marker of what happened there. You will only find the name on the wall, a simple iron street sign catching the low light, pointing to a past that lives on in the quiet spaces between the present. The street does not demand your attention. It simply exists as it always has, a witness to the lives that have crossed its cobblestones, the hopes that have been carried along its length, the stories that have been buried beneath the dust of time. I like to sit with the image of that street in the late afternoon, the shadows stretching long across the pavement, the air cool and still. I think of Arthur Thistlewood running his thumb over the worn grip of a pistol, not because he loved the violence, but because he believed it was the only language left. I think of William Davidson praying quietly before a meeting, holding his faith and his politics in a careful balance. I think of James Ings singing to his children at night, trying to fill the room with something other than fear. I think of George Edwards, his hands skilled in fragile beauty, weaving a destruction he would never have to answer for. I think of Richard Smithers, his pocket watch stopped at the exact moment of a struggle he did not start and could not finish. They were not heroes. They were not monsters. They were ordinary men caught in extraordinary currents, shaped by poverty, by conviction, by the quiet desperation of a world that had forgotten how to listen. The mystery of their story is not what happened in the loft. The mystery is how we remember it, how we weigh the truth against the silence, how we honor the lives that were lost without demanding that they fit neatly into our modern narratives. The past does not ask us to agree with it, it asks us to witness it. It asks us to hold the contradictions gently, to sit with the uncertainty, to acknowledge that the world is rarely as simple as the law or the newspaper would have us believe. The men of Cato Street made their choices. The government made its choices. The crowd made its choices. We make ours. Every time we turn our attention to the quiet corners of history, every time we listen for the voices that have been pushed to the margins, there is no grand revelation waiting in the shadows. There is only the slow, patient work of remembering, of piecing together the fragments, of allowing the past to speak in its own voice, without interruption, without judgment. The story of the Cato Street conspiracy is not a thriller. It is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a quiet meditation on the cost of waiting, on the weight of conviction, on the fragile line between hope and despair. It is a reminder that the world we live in was built by men who were tired, who were hungry, who were looking for a door, and who sometimes mistook a carefully laid trap for an open path. I will leave you with the image of the quiet brick wall of the modern Cato Street Mews, where a simple iron street sign catches the low February light. The hayloft and the horses are long gone, but the narrow street remains exactly as it was, unassuming, still, and holding its history in silence. The darkness falls early in winter, as it always has, wrapping the buildings in shadow, quieting the footsteps, bringing the long day to a gentle close. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you find rest in the quiet spaces of the story. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.